Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks to Spring Township Library for hosting our cooking program. We don't have a whole lot of people here, so we're recording it so that the township can show, the library can show the program to people from their website after it's over. So tonight we're making two cookies from cookies from around the world. So Beth B is there. Beth is there, and I already told her to preheat her oven to 400 degrees and to put 1/3 of a cup of water, cold water, in the freezer because we're going to need cold water for this recipe. So she did that, and I did that. So we're ready to start with the Mexican empanaditas. And people have probably heard of empanadas, which have meat filling most of the time, and they're shaped like a half moon. And these are very similar, but they're smaller, and they have either applesauce or jam in them. So that's the one recipe we're going to make. So that's a Mexican recipe. And then we're going to make a Russian no-bake cookie called kartoshka pierogiina, and they're in the shape of a potato. So we'll get started with the crust for the empanaditas. And you'll notice that I have two cameras, and one is the close-up camera so you can see what's going on in the bowl. And the other is the view of me. So I'm going to put my water in the freezer and get a mixing bowl. So we're ready with the mixing bowl. And Beth, we're going to mix 2 cups of flour in the bowl and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. So let's start with that. Now, when you measure dry ingredients, you should spoon it in until it's overfilled, and then use a butter knife from your silverware drawer to level it off. So it should go straight across the top. So there's my first cup, and then I'm going to do a second cup. And this will make the crust, it's almost like a pie crust we're making for the empanadita. So in my bowl, I have 2 cups of flour. And then the next ingredient we need is baking powder, which comes in a canister like this. And we want 2 teaspoons of baking powder just added to the flour. You always make sure they're leveled off. The next ingredient is 2 tablespoons of sugar. So the tablespoon is the biggest measuring spoon, and we want 2 tablespoons of sugar. And you notice that in the United States, we have cookies that are really sweet, but in Mexico, they're not so sweet. They're more like a pie crust with a sweet filling. Next, we want a teaspoon of salt. And then we need a half cup of butter. I'm sorry, yes, a half cup of butter. So a half cup is 1 stick of butter. And butter manufacturers are pretty smart because on the label, they show how many tablespoons, how many teaspoons, and then in the middle section, they tell you how many tablespoons equals a half a cup. So we need to chop up the butter and add it to our dry ingredients. So do that. And we just want to make it as small as possible. If you have a food processor, you can use that to make, use it on the pulse setting so that you make a crumbly mixture. It's all going to come together when we add that ice water that we just put in the freezer. So in our bowl so far, we have 2 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of salt, and now we're going to add our butter. And that's 8 tablespoons, 8 tablespoons. If you don't have a food processor, and a food processor is this, it's not a blender and it's not a mixer. But if you don't have that, you can use a fork and make sure you cover all the pieces of butter with the dry ingredients. And once they're covered, then you can kind of dig your hands in and just massage the butter to break it up. And you don't have to have it all mixed in, because when we add the water, that will help with mixing all the ingredients together. And now my mixture is getting crumbly. And Beth, I hope your mixture is too. It should be kind of like the crumb topping on a crumb pie or crumb cake. Is yours okay?
Yeah, I'm pulsing it in my
in the food processor. Okay, great. And I'm going to continue, even though I have the food processor, I know not everybody does. So I'm going to continue doing it with my hands. And once it's pulsed for Beth, then she can add her 1/3 of a cup of cold water. Now I measured 1/3 of a cup of water and I put the measuring cup in the freezer. We didn't want the mixture, the water to freeze into ice. So I did that right at the beginning of class. And now I added 1/3 of a cup of water. And I'm going to use a spoon to kind of toss the flour over the wet part so that I can mix it, and eventually it's going to come all together. You have to be patient when you're making a dough, especially if you're not using electric equipment that is more powerful, because it takes a while for it to come together. What I like to do is, after I have the water mixed in, but before it comes together, I just dump it on the counter. And Beth, you're using electricity for yours, so you may not have to do this. Yours may end up turning into a ball that goes around the blade of the food processor. Good. So I'm doing this to get the dough all stay together. And you notice I'm not putting my fingers right into the dough, because then you get a lot stuck in between your fingers. So I'm just kneading it with the heel of my hand. so that eventually it all comes together. And as I'm kneading it, if I see a lump of butter, then I just kind of press down on that and get that mixed in too. And when I'm finished, it'll all be together. My counter will be clean because all of the crumbs got mixed in. And Beth, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask.
Did you have a powdered surface that you were rolling onto?
Actually, I didn't because all the powder wasn't mixed in already.
Okay.
Okay, but we are going to do that to roll out
Okay.
the empanaditas.
Great.
And I'm going to use strawberry jam for my filling. That's my favorite way to have these. And Beth, you have your oven turned on to 400? Yes, okay, good. So my dough is all together. It's a nice dough because it doesn't, once everything's mixed together, it doesn't really stick to you. And it's manageable. So there are two different ways that you can do this next part. If you have a rolling pin, you can use a rolling pin and cut out triangles, circles for the dough. And you would flour up the rolling pin and flour the surface and then roll it out. And you want it to be probably a ½ inch thick. But another thing that you can do, because again, not everybody has rolling pins, and this is actually easier to do. So I'll show you that. You can just take your glob of dough and you can make a circle probably about the size of a racquetball. It's smaller than a tennis ball, but bigger than a golf ball. And if you roll that into a circle, then you can flatten it just with your hand if you don't have a rolling pin. And you can do one at a time this way. So once you have the circle and it's flattened, and this part is really important. You want to make sure that you take a small bit of the jam that you're going to use or the applesauce, and it has to land dead in the middle. It can't be smeared along the edges. So, and it doesn't have to be too much. So there's a sample. And then you need a fork from your silverware drawer. And when you fold this over, you're going to crimp the sides, but don't press down on the jam because that will cause the jam to squirt out. You want the jam to stay there, so leave it as a lump. And then I just put my fork in flour so that I wouldn't have it ripping the dough. So you're crimping it around the edges. And I think they make sandwiches for kids for school, but they call them Uncrustables. And it's bread with peanut butter and jelly in it or something like that. So it's similar to that. So that's what it's going to look like.
About how much jam were you putting in? Like, I mean, tablespoon, teaspoon?
Hang on, let me do one more, Beth. That's a good question. Let me do another one. And then I'll take a closer look at how much it is. Now you can make them smaller than racquetball size, but make sure all of the empanaditas are the same size. So if you make them smaller or if you make them bigger, I wouldn't recommend too much bigger though. So here I'm flattening. And
Can you use
then,
any type of jam?
excuse me?
Can you use any type of jam, or is
Yeah,
strawberry
yeah.
recommended?
No, you can use whatever you want jam wise. And I've seen people put Hershey Kisses in too, because then the chocolate
I
will
bet that's
melt
good.
inside. Yeah, I would say maybe a little less than a tablespoon, Beth, if you're making them the same size as mine. You just want it to be so that it's in the center, so that when you fold over half of it, you still have that lump and nothing squirting out the edges. So I'm sealing it, this time with my finger, but to make it look pretty, I'll use the fork. Did I answer your question, Beth?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I wasn't sure, you know. And about how thick is the dough in your?
It's probably not very thick, a quarter of an inch maybe.
Okay. I think
Yeah, I'll do the crust for another one. I'm going to put the crust away after I do a few of them and get them in the oven. But I'll show you what the side looks like. Because we're going to put cinnamon sugar on the outside after it comes out of the oven. So it will be a little sweeter, but you don't want it to be all dough, because it is more like a pie crust dough than a cookie dough. Okay, Beth, this is how thick mine is. Okay. So I'm going to do 3 and put them in the oven. And you have to really make sure that the edges are sealed. So that's why I'm using a fork. And I press down pretty hard on that. And then I flip it over and do the other side. And that pretty well seals it. So I have my oven on for 400 degrees. And we're going to put it in for, it says 15 to 20 minutes. So whenever our recipe gives a range of time like that, it always means start with the lower amount, because it'll be at least 15 minutes. But depending on your oven, it could be as much as 20 minutes. And that's because ovens cook differently. So Morgan, you may have an oven that cooks really fast. I may have one that cooks really slow, but we don't know until we put them in. So rather than putting it in for the upper number, it's good to put it in for the lower number, and then you can always add more. Okay. So I'm going to save the crust for later. Do the rest of mine. And I'm just going to clean up my workspace here so that I'm ready for the next recipe.
About how many cookies do you think that recipe will make if you make them all the same size?
Yeah, it depends if you make them on the bigger side or on the smaller side too. I would think probably about 15. Is that what you think, Beth? About 15?
I'm getting 12.
12.
That's,
Okay.
I was gonna ask the same thing, but I mean, I might be making them a little bit bigger than I'm supposed to, but I mean, I'm getting 12.
Okay.
Whether or not that's
So it really does depend. If you make them like pierogi size, you probably would get about 20. These are made bigger than pierogi size. Okay. So we're getting, I mean, I didn't do all of mine, but Beth's getting it.
Well, it's okay. You can keep moving on, but I was going to say I can easily put these in the oven because it's easy. I mean, this is easy. But question, did you put them on parchment paper or anything? Or are you just putting them right in?
Yeah, I put a piece of parchment paper on a cookie sheet and put them on and put them in the oven and set it for 15 minutes, and then we'll go back and check it.
Okay.
Because we want it to be just kind of turning golden, but not all over, like around the edges. But it'll look drier when it's baked than it does when you're working with it.
Okay. Great. And if you want to, you can, I mean, give me 1 minute and literally less than a minute. I'm just putting the last jelly in and then I'll deal with the rest.
Good. So for those of you who are tuning in from the library site after the class is over, you need 16 ounces of vanilla wafers, a half cup of cocoa powder, baking cocoa powder, a quarter cup of powdered sugar, 1 stick of butter at room temperature, and 1 can of sweetened condensed milk. Now this is sweetened condensed milk. This is evaporated milk. This is very wet and you can pour it more easily. The sweetened condensed milk is thick, almost thick, even thicker than pudding. And that's the one that you want to use. I'm actually doing a half batch of this. So I'll tell you the measurements, but if you notice that I'm not doing the same measurements that you are, that's why, because I'm doing a half batch.
Now, Kathy, sorry to bother you.
No problem.
I bought one of the Nilla wafer boxes. It's only 11 ounces.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that until right now. What do you suggest? Like I have like a box like this. It's only 11 ounces.
Yeah, I don't know why those darn Russians with their Kartoshka Perezhina, I don't know why they have it. Maybe in Russia the boxes are 16 ounces, but let's see, if you want to do a half batch, Beth, that might be an idea. Or you could add a little bit more powdered sugar and cocoa powder to it.
Okay.
So,
great.
So for the vanilla wafers, as I said, I'm doing a half batch. So you can put them in the food processor and pulse it until you get crumbs. If you don't have a food processor, then you can put them in a Ziploc bag and press down on it until they're all crumbs. I'm going to put these in the food processor. And then I'm going to pulse it. And now it's all crumbs. Putting that into a large mixing bowl. And you see, you want it to be, it looks like breadcrumbs, but it's vanilla wafers. So you want it to look that ground up. So if you did 16 ounces, you'll have 16 ounces in here. And then we need a half cup of cocoa powder. So you want to make sure that's leveled off as well. I'm going to reach into this bag and scoop out a half cup. Level it off. That goes in. And then you want 1/4 of a cup of powdered sugar. So it's white and it's powdered, it's not granulated. You can just stir those dry ingredients together. I have some lumps in my powdered sugar, so I'm using a fork to kind of break up the lumps. So then we're going to put in our stick of butter, which is 8 tablespoons of butter. And if you want to use a mixing bowl, an electric mixer, you can do that. And I'm just breaking it up so that it absorbs some of the dry ingredients. And then you add a can of sweetened condensed milk. And you can see how thick it is. And I always use a rubber spatula to clean out the measuring cup. Remember, I did a half batch, so you'll just be getting it out of the can, and it's very thick in the can. So you have to make sure that you scrape the can out too, Beth. And now I'm stirring it so that it gets all mixed. And I see some lumps of butter that I'm flattening with the wooden spoon. And the title of these, Kartoshka Perezhina, I'm not sure what Perezhina means, but Kartoshka means potato. So we're actually going to form them into the shape, if you think of a baking potato, but they'll be very small because, as you can see, these are pretty rich. Just stirring it, and pretty soon my hand's going to go in there to make sure I get it all mixed evenly. And these don't have any flour or eggs in them. And they would be probably the only things that you would have to bake them, because flour and eggs are in them. But this doesn't have flour and eggs, so we don't have to bake them. So they're almost like candy compared to American cookies. American cookies typically have eggs and flour in them. So now I'm kneading the mixture like I did with the empanadita dough. And I'm making sure that I get everything, all the dry ingredients that are in the bottom of the bowl. I'm making sure I get that all mixed in. And I'll scrape out whatever's left on the bottom and add it.
Since you're not baking them, do they just eventually get harder when they dry?
We're gonna coat them with powdered sugar and cocoa powder. So that'll make it so that you don't get your hands sticky when you go to eat them. But yes, they do.
Oh, okay.
They firm up some. They don't get hard. And you don't want them to be hard because they're a candy more than a cookie. So here we go. I have my dough ready. And you can see little bits of vanilla wafers in it, real small. So I have my cookie sheet ready. And then I need a small bowl because when we form these, we're going to roll them in powdered sugar and cocoa powder. So we're going to take 1/4 of a cup of powdered sugar and 1/4 of a cup of cocoa powder. The original recipe calls for it to only be cocoa powder that you roll them in. But I think that's a little bit too bitter by itself because it's the coating. So with the coating being the first thing that your mouth touches, it would be really bitter. So mixing together the powdered sugar with the cocoa makes it more palatable, more less bitter, a little bit more sweetness to it. So you want to mix that together. And Beth, how are you coming along?
I'm good. I was having some issues with my can opener, so, but I'm okay. I understand so far.
Okay, good, good, thanks. So then when you go to make them into potatoes, you roll them into a ball, and then we're going to make them like baked potatoes. So when you roll them into a ball, like I'm doing, and it's round, then you're going to take your hands and just go back and forth a little so that it gets more oblong. Then roll it in the powdered sugar and cocoa mixture. And these don't get any bigger. They don't flatten out because we're not putting them in the oven. We're going to put them in the refrigerator to chill. And then after they're done chilling, you can just put them in plastic bag or Tupperware or something to that effect. My empanaditas are finished. Whoops. That wasn't supposed to happen. They're finished. You can see they're just a little golden around the edges. And the dough looks dry. It doesn't look shiny anymore. So I'm gonna just for a minute move this aside so that I can show you how to finish the empanaditas. While they're warm, you want to pour a cup of sugar and a tablespoon of cinnamon into a bowl. So I have my cup of sugar. And in Mexico, they grow cinnamon. That's an herb that they grow, a spice that they grow. So that's why you'll see cinnamon quite often in Mexican recipes. So then after we have the tablespoon in, you want to just stir it up so it looks like a light brown instead of dark brown and white streak. And I'm going to wipe off the counter so I can bring the cookie sheet over for the empanaditas. And to finish off the empanaditas, you have your cinnamon sugar. You just pick up one of the empanaditas, put it in the cinnamon sugar, and just coat it on both sides. It sticks better if you do it when it's hot than if you wait until it's completely cold. It won't stick as well. And the empanaditas are finished. So I'm going to shut off the camera now, Morgan, and I'll get that processed and the link sent to you, okay? But we'll still be able to talk then once we are not recording anymore.